welcome back. As you can see, we've moved the lectern aside. Dr. Bentley and I are sitting in our comfy chairs up here on the stage, ready to take some questions. I should just remind people in the room that this event qualifies for basis points. So if you want to get your basis points, please make sure you signed the registration form at the door. So if you haven't already done that, make sure you do it on the way out. So just to remind you, if you want to ask a question, if you go to slido.com, enter the 2093 code, and then tap the tab marked questions at the top, and there's a little box where you can ask your questions. I'm not going to promise that we're going to get through all the questions that get asked, but we'll try and address some of them. If you put your name, you can keep it anonymous, but if you put your name against your question, then I'll ask you to stand up and ask your question directly from the floor, and you can add any nuances you like to your question. If you're a bit shy and don't want to ask it directly, then just submit it anonymously, and I might ask it from the chair. But I'm actually going to abuse my position in the chair and ask a question I've wanted to ask of Dr. Bentley. So if we could take someone in our audience here and magically transport them forward 15 years and put them on a farm in the UK, on producing cereals, what would they see that would surprise them, that would stand out as being different from either what we're producing or the way we're producing it now?
So I think my first comment is that there probably wouldn't be people on this farm of the future, but that will be covered in a later Arable Horizons talk. But I think this question about inputs and obviously the loss of chemistry for pest control, for disease control, is going to have a big impact on the way that varieties are produced. So I think you'll see on your farm gene-edited cereal crops which are able to resist diseases and pathogens, and some of this information will have come from work on diversity about mining our wild relatives and transferring that into crops. And I think you'll see reductions in the inputs that are added. So things like nitrogen, I think even by then the testing system will be different, and the need for this sustainability and the reduction of inputs. So we'll have to see crops that are bred to use less inputs, whether they be pest control, weed control, and chemical fertilizer inputs.
So that's good. So they could be better for the environment and better on the pocket of the farmer as well.
Yeah, I don't know what the yields will be like, and I guess that's the question. Can you do all these things and still maintain a crop that's able to produce the yields that it needs to produce?
Okay, I'm looking at my list of questions, and there is one with a name on it, so I'm going to pick that one first. That's Keith Norman. Keith, could you just wait till your microphone gets to you and then ask your question? It's just on its way.
Yeah, well, my question really is about the fact that wheat is one of the Gramineae family, which is the grass family, and most grasses are perennial, so you cut them and then they regrow and produce a new seed head the next year. What are the chances of actually making the wheat that we grow into a perennial crop? Because if you look at the savings year on year of establishment costs, etc., they would be significant.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and perenniality was originally on my list of these targets that we could work towards, and I think that's quite an active area of research, or at least an area of interest, about how do we make wheat perennial but retain all the characteristics that we have now. And so a lot of the research is still looking at a type of diversity breeding approach, so using things like agropyrum, which is a perennial grass, and using that as a mechanism to try and breed this perenniality into it. And certainly in the diversity breeding, you see these new types, which are perennial or have different lifestyle choices, essentially. So I think that area of research is certainly there and developing, and the potential for it is huge. I think getting to the point where you have something that agronomically performs like a cereal crop that you have in a field today is the challenge. And how do you redesign your farming system around a perennial crop? So how does that impact on the cropping system and the rotation and the machinery that you need? And I think I've talked about perennial wheat and this dream of perennial wheat to collaborators around the world, and had some fairly German replies from our German collaborators. He said, yeah, we tried that one year, and then the farm staff just dug it up because they thought it was weeds. So I think we're really not at the stage where we have any of this perennial wheat in development that looks even remotely like a wheat that we would recognize in a farmer's field. So I think we're still quite a long way away from that, but there's definitely the potential. And I think when we look at reducing inputs and soil, preserving the structure of the soil and soil health, that there's huge potential there. It's how we get to that.
So don't forget to keep asking your questions, and if you put your name on, then you'll get to ask it like Keith did just then. I'm actually going to pull together two of the questions that we've got here because I think we're related. So I think they're related. So someone has asked, and this is a question I have actually as well, how well do you think the general public understands the difference between genetic modification and gene editing? It was something you were talking about in the first part. And then the related question is, whose role is it to educate the public and increase science literacy around genetic technology, food production? Because certainly my impression is that there isn't a high level of understanding at the moment on that.
No, and I think they're both great questions about, do people understand? I think when you put the phrase genetic in anything, there's suddenly an assumption that you're talking about some sort of genetic modification or some sort of intervention which isn't favorable. And we get that when we talk about resynthesis, because this is something that sounds like it's synthetic, but it's actually recreating a natural process. So I think even at the fundamental level of what breeders actually do, how breeders use markers. So we say we use genetic information to improve breeding, and people assume that that's genetic modification. So I think talking about the difference between genetic modification and gene editing, there isn't enough knowledge out there to tell you what the difference between genetic modification and gene editing is on a practical, what are the differences between what you're actually doing. And because they use a common step, so you have to, even with gene editing, you have to be able to move this thing that you've created to cut and target into a plant. So you still have to transform it and go through this process as if you were genetically modifying. So I think there's a long way to go in the communication of the differences between genetic modification and gene editing. And I think it's the role of all stakeholders in agriculture to be part of the conversation. So I think genetic modification is a good example of where we didn't engage enough with the public to put the science and the facts and the ambitions of genetic modification into the public domain. So I think it's a conversation that needs to happen from people who are going to use this technology. So I think you would see potentially a farmer is a long way away from a lab that's producing a gene-edited plant, but actually that farmer could have a role to play in shaping how we view gene-edited plants. So if that's something that you see has potential to revolutionize a farming system which has reduced use of pesticides and herbicides, then that agenda can be driven at all points along that chain. And it's definitely the role of scientists as well to communicate the benefits and the things we're doing in the public sector, which is really trying to push forward our knowledge of what we can do with these technologies and to get them to a point where we can apply them.
Is that something that you and your team spend time doing, sort of trying to share these ideas with the public and put them in terms that the public can understand? Because some of these are quite complex ideas.
Yeah, and I think that is a big challenge for a scientist, obviously. So you're sat at your lab bench all day staring at these very complicated things and trying to do things which are really quite complicated technically. And I think a big challenge for scientists is how do we communicate what we do and why we do it and what we see as the potential for it, and that we can interact more with breeders and the industry to be able to tell people why we're doing things and what the potential that we see is.
Okay, let's have a look at these questions. We've got more coming in. I like this one here. So I don't know who's asked it. It's anonymous. So I'm going to have to ask it of you myself. If you could magic one trait onto crops tomorrow, so you've got a magic gene editing wand in your hand, you could magic one trait into crops tomorrow, what would it be?
Well, that's a tough one.
Maybe that's one more for the audience,
yeah.
actually.
Does anyone have any input from the audience on what it would be?
Was that a suggestion from someone in the audience as to what crop trait they'd like to see? Maybe you could put it in as a request for Alison's team. We have the microphone down here.
there's obviously lots of possibilities, but I think the biggest weakness of European agriculture is we can't grow soybeans. So a fairly realistic one would be a soybean that we can grow in the UK.
Is that something you could give him?
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, which I didn't touch on when we talked about what you could magic up in, or what you would see on a farm in 15 years. And one of the questions is, should we actually be changing the types of crops? You know, we grow very traditional types of crops. Actually, should we, if we're losing all this chemistry, we're losing the ability to produce things, will we actually be growing the same crops? And I think soybeans are a great example, and there are others. Other things that we could grow, and that is part of that is about breeding, about being able to adapt crops to the environments and the farming systems that are present in the UK. So I think that's a great suggestion to start the work. And one of the things about breeding is that you need to plan 10 years in advance what you're going to need. So we need to have some of this activity happening. Whether that's in the public or private sector, to kind of preempt what we might need in the future.
Okay, we've got another question here from Dave Ellerton. Now, are you in the audience, Dave, or are you someone on? Ah, great. I don't know what we'd do if it was someone listening in from the internet. If you just wait for the microphone to arrive.
Thanks so much. Yeah, my question is it possible to genetically modify or gene edit all arable crops? And are there some crops that are easier to modify than others? Or are they all pretty much the same because it's the same techniques?
Yeah, so it's technically possible to genetically modify most crops. So for example, at Niab, we can genetically modify potatoes, oilseed rape, rice, and wheat. So we have the ability to use this technology to genetically modify all of those species, because as you say, a lot of the techniques are common. And I think the thing that differs between them is the efficiency of that transformation and our ability to transform different genotypes, so different varieties of wheat. But the capacity is there in the actual tissue culture, the ability to do that transformation. And the differences are in the efficiency with which you can do them.
Actually, there's another area that I wanted to ask you about. I'm going to abuse my position again and ask another question. It's something you didn't touch on in the talk, but we talked about it briefly, privately, before you started speaking, and that's the ability to genetically modify plants so that they produce things that we don't currently produce in crops. So the example that I've certainly seen, I'm sure other people have seen, is the ability to produce fish oil in I think it's in a variant of oilseed rape or some member of that family. Do you think that's something that we're going to see significant development in the next sort of 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I think that's a question of what the market is for those products as well, and how we can what the options are for already producing it. And I think the camelina example from Rothamsted is a very good example of that, using modifying a plant to produce a fish oil which has health benefits and can be extracted. So I think it's really driven by both sides what's possible, and we can imagine what's possible and work out if we can do it, and what's a lot of the demand driven by the market. So for a lot of things, we're able to produce compounds cheaply or source them from fish and other things, but where are the needs? And that helps us to prioritize our ability to use plants as factories for industrial compounds, things like fish oils.
Okay, we've got a question here from Graham Potter. Is Graham Potter? Perfect. Graham, do you want to just wait for the microphone to come along?
Wow. My question is, with added weed pressure with winter, with black grass and brome and everything, and we are trying to control things in the spring now, do you think there will be a spring wheat variety coming across that's going to yield something similar to winter wheats in the future?
So the major difference between a winter wheat and a spring wheat, obviously, is the amount of time that it's in the field and the amount of time that it has to accumulate the biomass, which is the factory, the green factory, which then fills the grain. So I think the ambition of, in a 5-month period, in contrast to an 8, 9-month, 10-month period, being able to produce the same grain is very ambitious to be able to do that. But I certainly think in places like India, where you have two cropping cycles in a year, so you've got rice, which is 5 tons a hectare, and then wheat, which is 5 tons a hectare, both spring, so then you are yielding across that year 10 tons. So I think we need to look at it more within the rotational system about what we can actually achieve by growing spring crops, what that allows you to do with the rotation. But I think the physical, I don't think we're at the point where we have cereal wheat plants that can really produce that biomass, the green and the energy that's necessary to achieve the yields of winter wheat without that duration, because it really is that period of time when you're accumulating that energy and that then moves into the grain, and that's what gives you the yields.
Hello, yeah. If we go 15 years into the future, like you said before, and as a farmer, we're hoping to be growing maybe 20 tons a hectare of wheat in our farm, and then are we maybe thinking maybe 15 tons a hectare of spring cropping? I don't know. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it's these questions we have to ask, and where we're going to be and what we're going to do.
Yeah, and the ambition, I guess, is always to push yield and to get higher yielding, and then there's also the decision: do we maintain this drive for yield, or do we look at how can we use crops to produce other things which are more valuable, or how can we use that land area to produce higher quality crops? And so I think you're exactly right that these are really big picture questions that do need to be asked now.
Yeah, it's our future, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to put another poll up now. I might need James's help if I do this wrong, but James, I'm going to try and press the button. If what I do is wrong, you can fix it for me. And the poll question I'm going to ask is, would you grow or recommend the production of GM crops? So
far, 100. Can I get mine out?
I think we've only had one response so far because it says 100%. So
You can take a picture of that.
So that's still stabilising at a fairly high proportion of you that would either grow yourselves or recommend the production of GM crops. So that seems to have stabilised at just under, well, no, exactly on 90% saying yes. We'll come back to another poll question in a moment. Okay, I had a question there from Stephanie Jones, which I didn't fully understand. I'm hoping you can explain it. Stephanie, what's your question? Can we have the microphone to Stephanie, please?
Thank you. So you talked about nitrogen fixation and improving it by using GM to change the nitrogen fixation pathway of the plant. But maybe not from a public perception view the best thing to do, but would it be easier to genetically modify the rhizoba to interact better with the plant instead of the other way around, assuming that the bacteria is less complex, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so that you're touching on an area that I'm really not familiar with. How do we engineer bacteria to make better associations with plants? And my honest answer is that I don't know what the complication on the bacterial side is, but I assume it is, as everything is, a complex interaction between the two. Like you say, I wonder about public perception of we're going to just drench every field with GM bacteria and let them free. But it's a great question, and I think now we see for Zika, for example, we release GM mosquitoes into into cities, and that's acceptable because that's a public health issue. So maybe we do need to ask the question: can we modify bacteria which make crops produce nitrogen, and what are the implications of that? So I think it's a great question.
Now, Keith Norman's submitted another couple of questions. So as you're so enthusiastic, Keith, I'll let you have another bite of the cherry. Can we have the microphone over to Keith?
Okay, this is really a question about the wheat disease septoria, that we've seen it being very agile in the way it mutates against fungicide groups, whether it be triazoles, strobilurins, and now even SDHIs, even though they haven't been widely used for more than about 3 or 4 years. So it's very adaptive, and it seems to be overcoming a lot of the barriers that are put in front of it. Do you think that same agility will happen when you introduce traits, genetic traits into a plant, whether it's GM or gene-edited traits? Will it overcome those walls that you build to try and stop it from progressing as well?
I think with resistance, you have these R genes which break down very quickly, and you see that with Septoria and the rust. One of the options with using gene editing is actually you can modify the susceptibility, the things that make a host susceptible to a pathogen. So if you're able to actually identify what are the things that make a host plant susceptible to a pathogen, what's the thing that the plant, that the pathogen latches onto which allows it to infect, then there's potential that you could actually genetically modify those things that make a plant susceptible. So here you're not targeting a resistance, you're targeting the innate things in a plant which make it susceptible. And by editing that susceptibility, you make this interrelationship between the pathogen and the host a lot more complicated. So I think there's no guarantees that that won't be overcome with time, but because it's more genetically complex to manipulate something that's innate in the plant, that's a susceptibility, that it's some recognition with the pathogen, if you can edit that factor of the plant, so the thing that makes it susceptible to a disease, instead of adding something in new that's resistant, which can be quickly overcome. I think there are novel ways that you can investigate if that is a possibility, because we know a lot of the reasons why plants are susceptible to pathogens, so plants can be attacked by pathogens, and we add in resistance genes to override that susceptibility. But if we can go back and modify the factors which make it susceptible to start with, we change something in the plant that's much more difficult in theory for the pathogen to overcome.
I've got another question here that's anonymous, so I'm going to have to ask it myself, but it's one again that I'm interested in. Is there too much focus on yield rather than consumer benefits in breeding? And I know something that occurs to me, it seems to me that the fact that the public perception, one of the early uses of genetic modification was to allow crops to be resistant to Roundup, and therefore allow companies to sell more products to farmers. That probably, if you're trying to build public support for a technique, probably wasn't the best thing to choose as a first thing to sort of publicise. So how do you feel about that?
Well, I guess I would ask some of the farming community potential, or someone from Farmers Weekly, what percentage of the wheat grain that we produce goes to feed versus to food, because I think that's a very big question when we're talking about yield. So obviously if it's wheat for feed, then we want to pile them high, sell them cheap, and that's about the focus of the UK market and what we're actually growing for, let alone what are we breeding for. And there's certainly a huge scope for breeding for quality, and that's not something that's really done because of how the market is at the moment. Certainly we see genetic variation for many of these quality traits. So things that are higher quality or lower yielding or have a different grain protein deviation under different inputs of nitrogen. But how do we move that forward in a system that really supports wheat that's been grown to supply animal feed versus wheat that's been supplied for human consumption?
What do people in the audience think? Do people have a view on that? Do we think we've sort of shot ourselves in the foot a bit if we want to exploit some of these tools by maybe not focusing so much on some of the benefits that we could deliver to the consumer rather than the more the financial benefits? That's obviously not touched the nerve, that question. So let's...
Penny's got it.
Oh, Penny, you've got a view on that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If we could come up with something that had fabulous consumer benefits, that would be ideal, and that would really help to bring people around. But I think the problem is an economic one, really, because a breeder can only breed for a market. Breeding is expensive, so a wheat breeding programme, for example, is going to cost somewhere between £1.5 million, £2 million a year. To breed for potentially quite a niche market where the royalty returns are not going to be sufficient to be able to get you payback and also make a little bit of profit. It's just, I think that's where we've got the real barrier. That's why we go for the yield and the disease resistance and the agronomics, because those are the things that currently get the market share, and that market share is essential if you're going to survive as a plant breeder.
Oh, okay, yes, let's take a response from the back there. Can we move the microphone over there?
I think it's a big thing when we are taking our crops into whether we grow feed wheat or milling wheat, is to we always try and grow the best high-spec wheat that we can. Personally, on our farm, we grow half milling and half feed wheat. We have in our area we have a lot of feed mills, so they're only down the road. For us, it's economically viable just to grow a lot of feed wheat. But also we grow the milling wheat, hopefully we'll get the bonuses to see how we're going to go for it. And it's at the end of the day, it's down to what we get paid for it. And if we ain't getting paid right for it, we're only going to grow what's going to give us the best return at the end of the day. And if feed wheat's giving us the best return, that's what we'll grow. But then suddenly the milling wheat goes down, so everybody starts growing milling wheat again. So you start getting a bigger bonus, then the bonuses start coming back down again. So it's like a bit of a circle. So it goes from one side to the other all the time, I think. Personally, especially where we're growing up in North Yorkshire.
So I guess if we could genetically modify crops to deliver consumer benefits that consumers were willing to pay a premium for, and a significant premium, that could be something that would be...
Oh, definitely, yeah. And one thing I'd love to we always thought we might be able to do one day is maybe grow some Durham wheat at home and make some high-end pasta. But it's a project for the future, I don't know, But you've got to look into these things, and you've got to look at the high end these days. Everybody's going out buying posh sausages and designer food and things. And what, as an arable farmer, as a wheat grower, what can I grow on my farm wheat-wise as a posh product that farmers will pay, the public will pay more money for?
We're just about on our time limit, but I'm going to take one more question, and as you've all taken the trouble to come here tonight, I'm going to open it up, and just from a show of hands in the audience, who's got one last question to ask before we wrap up? Someone from the audience. Over here.
Thank you. One of the negative aspects that the public get is this Frankenfoods thing, and I put the thing up there. One thing that people highlight was putting genes from animals into plants. They're totally unnatural. You mustn't do that. It's okay or better plants reacting with each other. When you take genes from animals into plants, such as fish oil, what are your feelings on that? Do you think the sky's the limit, that if you're able to transfer a gene from a totally different organism into that should be perfectly okay? What's your feelings on that score?
Yeah, I think that's a social hot potato to handle, and a very good final question. And I think it comes back to the question of why would you want to do that? I think there has to be a reason why you would want to transfer something. So we use the green fluorescent protein, which is from a jellyfish. We put that into plants to be able to study the action of things and how be able to visualize what's actually happening on a cell-by-cell basis. So I think the question comes back to what would we be hoping to achieve by putting an animal gene, so it's something from very distant, something that's not genetically related. Would we actually be looking to do that from a biological endpoint? And then if there's a case that we need a mouse gene in a tomato, then we need to look at it, I think, as what can we potentially gain from that. So I'm going to not answer that directly, but yeah, I think it all comes down to, again, these are tools and technologies that we can use to address needs. And the Frankenfood thing kind of paints us as doing these things, in our closets, in our labs, just to create these kind of beasts. And we're really not doing that. We're doing it to drive genetic gain and to make progress that can benefit food supply. So on at the back.
Was that a supplementary at the back?
Footnote.
Can we pass the microphone back to Rose?
I think we need to challenge the public on these issues because they're quite happy for GM to be used for medical reasons. And the Ebola virus was, well, at least the antigen to produce the vaccine was produced in tobacco plants. And I'm sure the public are very happy with that. So we need to challenge them because of the hypocrisy that they're happy to accept these GM techniques for health to make them better, but then when it comes to food, they have a completely different attitude. So I suppose it's our job, isn't it, to challenge them.
Yeah, and that's really the take-home message. I think you can get the front page of all the national newspapers if you can treat leukemia with gene editing or gene therapies. But if you did that with the plant that you want someone to eat, then it's a completely different story. And it comes back again to how do we communicate this? How do we challenge people? Put up this slide which shows when you gene edit a plant, you get a mutation that you don't know how that got there, and it could have got there from conventional means. So what are we objecting to? What are we trying to regulate? Because it's not something that we can see. So that's it's a very good point that we need to do that challenging.
I don't know, maybe it's something we could build into the Open Farm Sunday programme. Just think about an opportunity when farmers get to interact on a large scale with the public. I'm going to wrap it up there. Hopefully we can take some sort of, those, and I include myself in this camp, who would like to see us making more use of these fantastic technologies and techniques because of the benefits they can deliver. We can take some comfort from the signs that according to opinion polls, consumers are increasingly more comfortable with these technologies and willing to accept them. I want to ask you all to join me in thanking Dr. Alison Bentley for a very exciting and interesting talk and for taking the questions just now. So thank you very much, Dr. Bentley.